On July 4th, 2012, Paul LeMaitre took the name Mount Marathon a little bit too seriously. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the LeMaitre. Every year on July 4th, the small town of Seward, Alaska, which has a population of just 2,500 people, hosts the Mountain Marathon race. It is a grueling trip up Mount Marathon to a location known as Race Point, which is a false summit, and then back down onto the streets of Seward. Now, you might be thinking that the race would be difficult because it's long. In fact, it's only a little over 3 miles. But it does go up 3,022 feet in elevation, and on this specific day in 2012, it had actually just rained the night before. It was a pretty wet condition. And even though this is July, we are talking about Alaska, a place where in the summer it is light 24 hours a day, and also very, very far north. So we're talking about average temperatures mostly in the 50s, even in July. To give you an idea what this race looks like, the average incline and decline that people are going up and down throughout the course of the race is 38 degrees, and it varies from near vertical sections down to more flat locations, but even these tend to have either dense brush or loose beds of shale. Records have been set for this race, which again sits at just over 3 miles and up and down 3,000 feet of elevation at just 41 minutes 26 seconds, with the average speed uphill being 2 miles per hour and the average speed going back down at 12 miles per hour. As you can imagine, with a course like this, minor injuries are pretty common. Racers are no strangers to broken bones, sprains, cuts, bruises, even concussions. But it is very rare that people get serious, lasting injuries for the race, partially because of just the general athleticism of Alaskans being higher than, your average person from Manhattan. This year, it had rained the night prior, and temperatures were sitting at just 52 degrees Fahrenheit, or 11.11 degrees Celsius. This left the trail cool and slick, with sections that had actual snow flows with ice beneath it, which is an incredibly dangerous thing to actually be running on, especially without crampons if you're just wearing sneakers like many of the racers do. For those who don't know what crampons are, they're like cleats, but for rocks. The race itself is run in 3 sections, with the first being the juniors, under 18s, the second being women who are over the age of 18, and the final being adult men. The race is also typically capped at 350 people in both of the adult categories, with a smaller number for the junior categories. Now, in 2012, there actually were more significant injuries than usual. One, Penny Assman, was a military veteran from the Iraq War. She had been a Black Hawk pilot. She slid over a ledge and broke several ribs, as well as lacerating her liver. Later, during the men's section, another runner, Matthew Kenny, slid in the same spot and actually suffered severe brain damage and has not been able to remember the race itself. He also broke both legs, which is just extremely unfortunate. And the final casualty of the day was Paul LeMaitre, who, despite being in fairly good shape, was not exactly in a position to be running this particular race. Paul was a 65-year-old businessman originally from France who immigrated to the United States, got married here, and, integrated himself fairly well into Alaskan life. He had recently run a 12K, he was a very common sight at the local gym, and even at his senior age, he still maintained a full head of brown hair with blue eyes and a pretty solid build for his age. Paul was also just a good man. He was an accredited grief counselor who actually had volunteered to work with children orphaned by the 9/11 attacks. And he worked at a local Air Force base as a counselor for people transitioning out of military life and into civilian to make sure that they had all of the skills and jobs they needed lined up to just seamlessly get back into society. He also had skied the Iditarod, which is a cross-country wilderness race, twice, coming in dead last both times. Why did he finish last? Well, because he had never actually trained for the event. This was kind of a common theme for him. He would just go and do things like this without any training. Once there's even an anecdote where he and a friend took a skiff out to an island and ended up getting blown off course, and the friend actually remarked that he was pretty sure the only reason they were still alive was that they entertained God. But the night before this particular race, Paul and his wife Peggy attended a rookie training session that was led by a Tim Liebling. Now, Tim told everybody in the room, if you have not actually gone up and down the mountain, if you have not walked the trail for the race, you should go home. You should not race today. Paul, who had not walked the trail for the race and had never even been up the mountain, was unfazed and decided he was going to do it anyway. Now, to properly understand what happened to Paul, you need to understand the layout of the race itself. It begins in downtown Seward, and Paul particularly started off at 3:15 p.m. on 4th Avenue, and it just takes a couple of minutes of running down the street before you actually hit the mountain itself. The first obstacle is a near vertical rock face that requires hands to climb. You actually have to rock climb. It's not just a nice hike. And that is followed by a 60% grade hill, a dirt trail that leads up to a little section of wilderness. And for those of you who are not architects, that is a 30-degree slope. Almost immediately after hitting the dirt trail, Paul started to drop behind. Now, not a super big deal because you can actually see the race almost all the way up as long as weather is clear, except for that dense spruce forest that makes up the kind of middle third of the race. There's just nothing you can do there. There's no way to see into it, and beyond it is a wide bed of shale and exposed rock. So as long as you make it out of the spruce forest in either direction, you're going to be visible from the ground. After you leave that dense forested area is when you hit the exposed rock. It's just shale that actually can, in some places, be loose, and loose enough that you could slide about up to your ankle, if not a little bit higher, into the rock itself. The midpoint of the race is a grassy knoll from where you can shoot President John F. Kennedy, round a rock and head back down. And this marks the midpoint of the race. At this point, you get to a bunch of decisions that you have to make regarding how you want to get down. There are some much safer routes, and there are some routes that are basically just a free fall down the side of a mountain, occasionally stopping yourself on ledges. The last photo taken of Paul shows him coming up this exposed rock section. He's smiling, he looks happy, he looks like he's doing just fine, but he is not carrying any water with him. Now, Paul actually made the ascent with no real problems. The only issue was that he was 45 minutes behind the alleged last runner. Someone had gotten up to race point, had seen Tom Walsh, the race steward, who would stand there and mark people's times, hand out water, and let them know what to do next. 45 minutes before anybody saw Paul. So what happened is this one last guy gets up the mountain. He tells Tom, "I'm the last guy." Tom waits 45 minutes. They start to pack up and begin heading down. At this point, they see Paul. So he is way behind. It's about 6 p.m. at this point, 5:45, 6 p.m. And you have to remember this was Alaska in the summer. The sun was nowhere near going down at 6 p.m. This isn't late in the day for them. Now, the spot where Paul encountered Tom is only 200 feet from race point. So the rock was in plain view. There was really no way of mistaking it. It's a large rock. Tom pointed up, said, "There's the rock." Encountering Tom, Paul asked, "How far am I from the top?" To which Walsh responded, "About 200 feet, which is about 60 meters. Paul then asked, "Can I still get a finish?" And Tom said, "Yes, just go up, turn around the rock, and come back down." And while it was a little bit foggy, it was not foggy enough that you could miss seeing the rock itself. Walsh turned around and started going back down the mountain before thinking about it, turning back around and yelling back up to Paul, What's your bib number?" To which Paul responded, 548. According to Walsh, LeMaitre did not appear to be struggling. He wasn't out of breath. He didn't look injured. He was just moving very slowly. At the point where he separated from Paul, he texted race officials, 548 should be home in about an hour and a half, because he was assuming it was probably going to take Paul longer than the record of just 10 minutes to get down, which was reasonable. Now, assuming that Paul actually did reach race point and turn around where he was supposed to, he was facing a grueling set of challenges to get down. And for this section of the story, I'm taking a lot from an article called The Last Man Up by Christopher Solomon from Runner's World, which will be linked in the description if you want to read it. It's extremely well written. I highly recommend it. But as you go down, this is basically just a long fall where you are using your legs to slow yourself. If you've ever done a mountain race or done any training where you're going up and down a mountain quickly, the way down is actually a lot harder. Your legs are exhausted. You've got to constantly be absorbing shock from the rocks, and it's very difficult. It's very easy to trip, and if you lose your balance, you're facing a very difficult slide down at high speeds. In fact, Christopher Solomon, in his article for Runner's World, described it as a caveman steeplechase. A steeplechase is a track and field event where you have a bunch of obstacles in the way, basically. I did it once years ago. It was not fun. If you want to have an idea, though, about what me running a distance event in a track and field thing looks like, I was a sprinter and a hurdler and a long jumper, so the one time I tried to run the mile, I made it 2 laps, and then I had to quit. I actually physically could not keep going. I was going to throw up. I'm not a distance runner. If you ever want to go hunt the Wendigo, bring me along because you will outrun me. But the first step in this caveman steeplechase down the mountain is a long and steep snowfield, which many people will simply get a running start and then just slide all the way down. Following that, there is a pretty solid trek through loose shale that is about shin deep. And then about halfway down the descent journey, you run into a spot called the Chute, which is basically just a snow funnel that then ends in something they call the Gut, which is a snow-covered creek that you have to run down. And the texture of the creek bed has been described by people who ran the race as like wet kitty litter, so you can imagine how comfortable that is. And Solomon writes that at this point, because he took the trip himself, it's just total mental and physical exhaustion. According to race veteran Sam Young, who he interviewed for the piece, at this stage in the race, people don't even know their names, and they're just like, they're unconscious. They're the walking dead. They are just trying to get to that end, that finish, so they can go somewhere warm, grab some food, and grab a beer. Sam Young is actually also a 3-time winner, though one of those times is a split victory with a Bill Spencer from 1986, where they actually crossed the finish line hand in hand after just being neck and neck the entire race. And they decided, you know what, we're so close, we're just going to win it together. But following the Gut is the final bit where you have to come down a set of crags that are 25 feet high in some places before you finally are faced with a 1-kilometer sprint to the finish line on the streets of Seward. So it's an incredibly difficult final piece here. If you ever run something like a Spartan race, it's, that level of exhaustion. And had Paul made it down the mountain through the spruce forest and to the crags, he would have been plainly visible from the ground. Granted, not many people outside of his family were still watching the race at this point, but had he made it out of that spruce forest, he would have been visible. Now, that text that Tom Walsh sent, saying 548 will be down in about an hour and a half, went out at 6 p.m. By 8 p.m., Paul was still not back, and they pretty hastily assembled a search team. Now, the initial search was just volunteers, local first responders, people who were on hand to actually start combing the mountain. But it would take until 2 a.m. for the state police to finally arrive with a helicopter equipped with the infrared sensors necessary to scan the ground for traces of Paul via either heat signatures or being able to pick out little depressions in the snow that would mark footprints. And they searched essentially all night. However, even if Paul was still alive at this point, it had begun to sleet, and he was not wearing the correct garments for this. In case you don't know what sleeting is, it's when it's a little bit above the freezing point, usually in the high 30s, low 40s, where ice starts to form in the rain, and you get a mixture of wet rain and solid ice rain. So it's not super dangerous. It doesn't feel good on your skin, but the most important part is that it's freezing cold and it's wet. So if you get covered in sleet, you're going to freeze to death pretty quick. And at this point in the evening, it was about 47 degrees. And at this point in the evening, it was about 47 degrees Fahrenheit or 8.3 degrees Celsius. Seriously, Celsius people, your numbers are not reflective of how temperatures feel. They were not giving up, though, despite the terrible weather. These are Alaskans. They're some pretty hardy people. So, in the morning, the Air National Guard for the state of Alaska, if you're not from the United States, each of our actual states have their own militaries. These are called our National Guard. They are part-time. They're not quite reservist positions, but they are not full-time active duty military. But they do receive the exact same basic training and advanced individual training that every other branch of the military receives. So these are fully trained soldiers, pilots, so on and so forth. The 210th Rescue Squadron of the Alaska Air National Guard brought in a Sikorsky S-70 Pavehawk, which is the search and rescue variant of the Black Hawk helicopter. It has the HH-60 designation. It's equipped with state-of-the-art technology that is purpose-built to find downed pilots. So they're looking for all the signs that would mark any sign of somebody being alive on the ground. For that entire day, the State Trooper helicopter and the Pavehawk circled the mountain just looking for signs of Paul. On the ground, between 40 and 60 rescuers were circling the mountain, climbing up and down, going into little crags, basically trying to find any place that Paul could have somehow fallen into, and blowing whistles so that if he actually was on the mountain and conscious, he could either call out or come find them. And on top of the human searchers and the helicopters, they also brought in dogs who had Paul's scent so they could search for him that way. But the dogs failed to turn anything up, Nobody found any sign of Paul, and the helicopters picked up absolutely no trace of him. And at this point, they started to try and consider the possibilities. What could have happened to Paul? Well, in order for him to not be responsive to anything, and in order for him to have not made it down the mountain, it has to have been something sudden. It was theorized that perhaps he stepped onto some soft snow and fell through it on a snow bridge over a creek, and at that point he would have been invisible to heat sensors, and it would have been pretty quick that he got covered up, which would be a pretty awful death. It was possible that he also rushed through the brush in the densely forested section and hurt himself that way, broke an ankle, hit his head, did something that, caused him to fall unconscious, and that's why he wasn't responsive to anything. However, they knew that the snow was going to melt due to the weather getting a little bit warmer over the course of the next week, and figured, if he's somewhere in the snow, at the very least we'll be able to find his body. It'll be somewhere, it'll be visible to our sensors, we can figure this out. But as the days dragged on, the rescue effort quietly turned into a recovery effort, and there were still no signs of Paul, even as the snow melted away and even as people searched every possible corner of the mountain from the area he could have been, assuming he turned around at Race Point. Because the other option is that perhaps he kept going up a game trail that's on the mountain, but even then, he would have known at some point that he's gotten off to the wrong start. 4 days into the search, the Alaska State Police called off their efforts, but the fire department and the LeMaitre family both continued to search for several more weeks. But as the weeks dragged on and there was absolutely no sign of Paul, the fire department eventually withdrew, and even LeMaitre's family kind of accepted, all right, we're probably not going to find him. According to an interview taken in October of 2012, the same year that Paul disappeared, his daughter, Marianne LeMaitre, was pretty confident that he was dead, but remained hopeful that they could find a body and bring some closure to the family. Around this same time, it was kind of understood that Paul wasn't coming back, and they did file to have him declared dead by the courts. However, the state troopers maintain an open case file because, as far as their protocol is concerned, somebody is not off the missing persons list until either they've been found alive or found dead. So, as far as the state troopers are still concerned, this is an open missing persons case. In the aftermath of Paul's disappearance, Seward did make several changes. Specified time milestones have to be met by all runners or they are forced to drop out by the race stewards. Dropping out means that they are told to turn around and go back down the mountain. They are not allowed to continue, they are not allowed to finish, they're done. Rookies are now required to at least walk the course before the race and then report on the course itself to prove that they did it to the veteran racers who, of course, run the whole event. Rather than having racers just know that there are routes down the mountain and expecting them to know what they are, they have now placed signs that mark, okay, here's the actual, safest possible route, here's a less safe route, here's an unsafe route. They're basically told which ways they can get down the mountain without killing themselves. And now, whenever the race is finished, a hiking team actually sweeps the entire course to make sure that if anybody did fall, or if somebody was injured, if somebody was knocked unconscious, whatever, if there's somebody on the course still, they will make sure that they find them. And of course, now they're not allowed to leave until it's confirmed that everybody has finished the race. In 2014, Peggy LeMaitre, Paul's wife, did sue the Seward Chamber of Commerce, who sponsor the race, for acting negligently, for not being, as on the ball as they could have regarding Paul. The fact that they didn't wait for him and that Tom went down the mountain first. She actually asked for $5 million, but then eventually lowered her request to $45,000, and finally they settled out of court for $20,000, which is essentially just to cover attorney's fees. Because the courts were looking at it and saying, all right, there's negligence, but there's not negligence to justify any sort of penalty. Paul should have known. He was told that he shouldn't do this without having checked the case out. Paul knew that he was new to this. He knew he was supposed to actually run the course before running the race. So as far as anyone was concerned from a legal standpoint, Seward didn't do anything wrong here. One other factor that came out during the court case was that Paul himself actually had very poor vision. Poor enough that he had to settle a dispute with an employer over it just a couple of years prior. So while the rock was pretty plainly visible, it's also possible that Paul didn't see it. What makes this case genuinely perplexing, though, is not the fact that a 65-year-old man was not able to complete a race. It's the fact that nobody could find him. People who knew this mountain very well, who had all the technology you could possibly need to find somebody on it, who just combed this mountain for days, weeks, in some cases with his family for months, nobody could find Paul. there was no trace of him. There's nowhere that was unsearched that he could have gone. And while there are black bears in the area, it was kind of deemed unlikely that he was a victim of any sort of animal predation. So is it at the point where we're talking it being as incredible as Chris Tompkins, who disappeared from directly behind several of his friends with absolutely not a sound, all of the stuff falling out of his pockets and them finding his shoes stuck in a fence? It's not quite that level of mind-boggling, but it's still strange. It is still unexplained. And until they actually do find Paul's body, if they ever do, we probably won't have any clue what happened to him. Because, again, they can't find any sign of him. No clothes, no bones, no tracks. There was never anything. It's been 10 years since Paul disappeared, and his family has come to terms with the fact that he is gone. The Seward Mount Marathon race has been adjusted to be a little bit more safe, but at the end of the day, Alaskans kind of like how dangerous the race is. They like that it's a real test, so they didn't get rid of it, and it's still extremely popular. There hasn't been an actual drop in registration numbers, and the only year it hasn't been run in the last 100 was 2020 during the pandemic. As far as I'm concerned, this one could go either way in terms of being just a case of somebody getting off course versus something actually happening to them, someone or something taking them. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. We'd be happy to talk with you. We'd be happy to see what kind of conclusions other people come to. And if you like what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can support us on Patreon for just $1 a month. You can buy Lore Lodge merch on the lorelodge.shop, and you can check out all of our other sponsorship links in the description below. We have an Amazon.com storefront where you can go and you can see curated lists of things we've put together. And if you need a cup of coffee, well, we've got you covered there too, because through Tableau Roasting Company, we have Mount Pocono Perk, which ships directly to your door. You can get it whole bean or you can get it ground, and it is a delicious blend that I designed myself. So, if you're a coffee lover, make sure to check that out, and I guess we'll see you on the next one. My name's Aiden Mattis. Thanks for stopping by the Lore.